Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Come have a seat. We're going to get started. Get this party started. I recognize that this today is only the lecture. I was getting a little worried because Dr. Lupovitch was a little late. And I told him when he walked in, thank God you're here, because when the speaker for the Israel trips doesn't show up, I can do the lecture. When the speaker for the Morocco trips doesn't show up, we're in trouble. Of Salachas. So I'll introduce him once again in a second. But we do have, for those of you who are going, there are people here not traveling with us to Morocco. So I apologize for the first 5 minutes here. But there's a little bit of business we have to do, some announcements we have to make. The first one is the most joyful of the announcements. We are very excited to announce that Rabbi Hornston and her husband Sheldon Stern will be joining us in Morocco. So that's great news because I really love Sheldon. No, I mean, it's great news. It's great news all the way around. Sheldon, we've been wanting to have the Stern Hornstons with us, especially because Sheldon actually is of Moroccan heritage and has a Moroccan family. But we couldn't really announce it until everyone had actually paid, because we had enough people on, in theory, to bring that many clergy. We did not have that many people committed financially to bring that many clergy. So once the deadline came and everyone paid their bill, we were able to announce that Rabbi Hornston will be joining us, which means that every day there will be a rabbi on every bus, different rabbi, but a rabbi on every bus, and then the cantor will make crazy as he always does, and being responsible for our fun. Okay, so that's the most exciting announcement. The rest of them are not as exciting. Speaking of paying your bill, those of who are coming with us have all paid in full, which is great, except we did have one couple that was not able to go because of a medical issue and had not bought the insurance. And they're losing a lot of money, and there's nothing we can do about it, and it's very frustrating. So please, I beg of you, if you have not done it, please go online and buy the travel insurance now. And there's a new twist to it, which is that the clergy, we all decided, we're getting a little older now, and we all decided that we are purchasing an additional travel insurance. We're getting it from MedJet. There's also AIG has one, and that is just basically air ambulance insurance, essentially. That hit me when my wife had an incident in Vail, Colorado, and she had to take an ambulance ride only to Denver, Colorado, and that was $4,000. So out of our pocket. So imagine from Morocco to Beaumont. Okay, that would be a much bigger ambulance bill. So it's not that expensive. It's not something we've ever actually pushed before, but all of your clergy have decided to do it, and it might be a good idea for you as well. So that's insurance. The third thing is those surveys that were sent out. They are really important. I have to start working on a variety of issues starting next Tuesday. So please, 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 we need your data. We need all that stuff. If you have problems, some people were saying they were having problems filling it out. Nope, don't worry about it. Donna will come over to your house and do it with, no, she won't. But you can come and actually, she will walk you through it at your home. And finally, the only thing that can really go wrong, besides the insurance issue that I've discussed, is the passport issue. So if I'll say this at every time we get together, you really, if you haven't done it, you must go home, check your passport. It has to be good from 6 months from the date we're returning home. So it really is the only thing that could go wrong. You could show up at the airport and they will not let you into Morocco. So, or maybe not let you out. So either way, it's not good. So please do that. Yes? B'nai B'rith. Wow. B'nai B'rith, okay. Excellent. And you get to support a Jewish organization at the same time. Who would have thunk? Okay. B'nai B'rith seems to have evacuation insurance as well. Right. They don't fly you anywhere, but they go oy vey the whole time while you're Okay. With no further ado, we are very excited, as always, to invite. Really, it's become Temple Israel scholar in residence, Dr. Lupovitch, to speak about Morocco. I do want to say one thing about the Cohn Haddow Institute, though, which he heads. You may not know that Temple Israel has a very close role with the Institute, in that Rita Haddow was a founding member of Temple Israel, grew up here, and just a dear member of our Temple family. So there is besides Howard, there's another connection between us and the Institute. It's a wonderful place led by a wonderful man and a scholar. So, Howard.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I should say that Rita Haddow, she's a Cohn and a Haddow. She's Rita Cohn Haddow. So, in full disclosure, but yes, she's wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. Congratulations again for going on this trip. Good for you. It's going to be a great experience. So, for those of you here last time we spoke about really the early history of Jews in Morocco. We spoke about the political situation of Jews in Morocco. We spoke about Morocco as part of the world of Islam and what it meant to be Jewish in the world of Islam. Really, we were speaking about, I guess we would say, external things, the external world around the Jewish community of Morocco. This week, I want to look internally into the internal Jewish life of what it means to be a Moroccan Jew, and that's why I want to focus this evening on a particular, let's call it a brand of Judaism, Sephardic Judaism. Now, I'm going to, before I really dive into it, I'm going to start by making an assumption here. I'm going to assume that most of us in this room this evening are Ashkenazic Jews. Is that a fair assumption? Just out of curiosity, show of hands, how many here are Ashkenazic, meaning, okay. So there are very few among us who are actually Sephardic Jews? Yeah. Or Mizrahi, or something other than Ashkenazic. Well, good. Now, that's what I was figuring. And so the reason I want to focus on Sephardic Jews as a way of understanding what it meant to be Jewish in Morocco is two things. The second one is that after a certain point, after 1492, when Jews begin to leave Spain, Moroccan Jews as a whole, or Moroccan Jewry, becomes Sephardic, which I will define in a moment. But even before before they were officially Sephardic, to understand what Sephardic means, it really was the whole Sephardic mystique, the whole Sephardic mentality was very much defined by being in the world of Islam. And so what we call the Sephardic mystique was not only true of Sephardic Jews, but was true of Jews who lived in the Islamic world generally. I should also say by word of introduction, I hope you didn't see the word mystique and are expecting me to talk something about mysticism. I'm not going to say anything about mysticism tonight. Maybe it might come up in passing. I don't know. Okay. Now, let's be clear first what we mean when we say Sephardic. And I think there is a common Ashkenazic misapprehension about the term Sephardic or the category Sephardic, is that we as Ashkenazic Jews often tend to assume that if you're not Ashkenazic, you're Sephardic, or all Jews who are not Ashkenazic are Sephardic. That is not the case. There are many different kinds of Jews who are not Ashkenazic, but are also not Sephardic. Italian Jews are not Ashkenazic or Sephardic. Yemenite Jews are not Ashkenazic or Sephardic. Persian Jews are not Ashkenazic or Sephardic. And if you know Persian Jews and you call them Sephardic, they will be deeply, deeply offended, as only Persian Jews can be. The point being that when we say someone is Sephardic, it has a very specific nuance. It really has two definitions. First of all, it has a geographic definition. Sephardic means that your ancestors came from Sepharad, which as we shall see, is a Hebrew term that eventually came to denote Spain or more broadly, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. So there's a genealogical component, but no less important, there is a cultural component as well. Because there are many Sephardic Jews, even if genealogically they don't trace their family tree back to Spain or the Iberian Peninsula, they embraced the culture of Sephardic Jews. And as we'll see, one of the unusual aspects of being Sephardic is that there were parts of the Jewish world that were originally not Sephardic, but when Sephardic Jews arrived, they became Sephardic. And this is something rather unusual. But we'll get to both of those. Where does the term come from? Originally, the term Sephardic comes from a Hebrew word Sfarad, which in modern Hebrew means Spain. But the word Sfarad originally occurs in the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible. And originally, it's not necessarily talking about Spain. It occurs in the Hebrew Bible. You know, there's the sections of the Bible that are all the begats, all the genealogies. That's where we find individuals, descendants of Noah, descendants of Abraham. One is named Ashkenaz, one is named Sepharad. But eventually, the Jews who actually lived in Spain, they came to see themselves as descendant of that aboriginal Sepharad in the Bible. Moreover, for Jews who lived in Spain, they used that connection to express ancient origins. So look at your handout. Look at text number 1. Here's a verse from the prophet Obadiah. Now, the prophet, or Ovadia in Hebrew, Ovadia, he was one of the prophets who wrote about the Babylonian exile, which took place 586 BCE, when the first temple in Jerusalem were destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And he makes a reference. This is from the book of Obadiah. Well, there's only one chapter. There's only 20 verses. It's very short. And this is chapter 1, or verse 20. And he makes reference to something called Galut Yerushalayim Asher Bisfarad, the Jerusalemite exile community of Sfarad. Now, Jews who lived in Spain, they used this verse to make the claim that the original Jews who came to Spain had come directly from Jerusalem in 586 BCE. I think we noted this last time when we spoke about the first Jews of Morocco. One of the things that Jewish communities everywhere love to do is to imagine, or if we're being a little more cynical, to conjure up ancient origins. All Jewish communities do this. By the way, as American Jews, anytime you heard anything about Columbus being Jewish, or someone on Columbus's ship was Jewish, or something about that voyage was Jewish, that's us creating ancient origins for ourselves as American Jews. And there's no Jewish community in the world that didn't play this game in some fashion or another. But for Jews in Spain, this game involved, Jews came directly from Spain, from Jerusalem. That was one version of it. And of course, eventually some Jews in Spain said, well, maybe that's a little far-fetched. Maybe that's reaching too far. If you look at text number 2, a medieval biblical commentator named Abraham ibn Ezra, who was from Spain, he had an interesting comment on that verse from the book of Obadiah. This is text number 2. When it said, Galut Yerushalayim Asher Bisfarad, he says, we have learned from the great sages that the land of Alemania, which is a medieval French and Latin word for Germany, those are Canaanites who fled from the children of Israel when they arrived in the land. That's a way of saying that, you know, the Germans are actually, subservient, or they should be. Their origins are not as impressive as Jews. So too, Tzorfat, which is the modern Hebrew word for France, refers to France, and here's the important. And according to Targum Yonatan is one of the earliest Aramaic translations of the Bible. Sfarad is España, which of course is Latin for Spain. And this refers to the exile of Jews by Titus He was the Roman emperor who destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, a prophecy of the future, and not as Rabbi Moshe taught, an earlier rabbi, when the Jews were dispersed during the destruction of the First Temple. So some Spanish Jews believe that the first Jews came from Spain, directly from Jerusalem after the destruction of the First Temple. Other Jews in Spain believe that the first Jews came to Spain after the destruction of Jews during the Second Temple. And you're wondering, does it really make any difference? Not one bit. These are just two different stories which have the same message. We Jews have been in this part of the world for a very long time. And we've been here since before there was such a thing as Christians, before there was such a thing as Muslims. We are the original people here. So we belong here as much or more than anybody else. So this is where the term Sephardic, where it really struck deep roots. Now, look at the maps on the first page. I think one of the ways to really sort of give us a clear sense of what it means to be Sephardic, since many of us are Ashkenazic, is to draw a contrast, or a number of contrasts, between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazic Jews. And there are a number of ways we can contrast them. And I think the first way to start is geographic origins. So I'm going to tell you a little map story here, but then I'm going to explain to you why the map story is important. So look at the map on the left. This is the map of the Muslim world, let's say circa 900 CE. The Muslim world at an early high point, and you can see all the way to the left, you see Cordoba, which is in Spain, and right below that is what is today Morocco, which, remember from last time, is known as the Maghreb, the west, sort of the western frontier of the Muslim world. And all the way to the left is what is today Iraq. That's where Babylonia was. Now, the oldest center of Jewish life in the Muslim world was in Baghdad, which was in Babylonia, and it was ruled by Persia, and today is in Iraq. And the migration of Jews across the Muslim world was an east-west migration. Jews moved from Babylonia west across the Muslim world, all the way to the end, all the way to Spain, all the way to Morocco as well. Those are the origins of Jews in Morocco, Jews in Spain, so the original Sephardic Jews, but also the original Moroccan Jews as well. Look at the map of the right. The map of the right, this is a map of what is today Germany. These are the original Ashkenazic communities. And the migration of Jews to the Ashkenazic world is not an east-west migration from Babylonia to, from like Babylonia to Spain or Babylonia to Morocco, but rather it's a south-north migration. If you move south from Germany, right below Germany is Italy. And if you keep going across the Mediterranean, right there is the land of Israel. The first Jews who came to Germany and Italy came directly from the land of Israel, a south-north migration. Why is this significant? Here is why this is significant. The first Jews who came to Morocco and Spain, they came from another part of the Muslim world, and the Muslim world was, compared to the Christian world, was far more accommodating, was friendlier to Jews. Remember, for the first 1,000 years of Islam, it was better to be Jewish in the Muslim world than it was in the Christian world. The first Ashkenazic Jews, they came from the land of Israel via Italy at a time when the land of Israel was being ruled not only by Christians, but by the Byzantine Christians. Which means the first Jews who came to Ashkenaz, who came to German Central Europe, they came from a world which was, well, not that friendly to Jews. In fact, in many ways, it was antagonistic and very restrictive of Jews. And this one fact would shape the larger religious and cultural outlook of Ashkenazic versus Sephardic Jews. Now, the big stuff, they all shared the same beliefs about a lot of things. God, prayer, commandments. They both regarded the Babylonian Talmud as the ultimate Talmud. They were similar in a lot of ways, but their attitude toward the outside world was different. Jews who lived in the Muslim world, in general, they saw the outside world as less antagonistic, and so they were more freely willing to live in it. Jews who lived in the Muslim world unselfconsciously lived with one foot in the world of Judaism and one foot in, let's call it, mainstream Muslim society. First of all, Muslim society was more willing to let Jews do this. In some ways, it was a more fluid society. But also, because there was less external antagonism, Jews were more willing to do this, as opposed to the Ashkenazic world, who came from the less friendly world of Byzantine Christendom. They were warier of the outside world. And so Ashkenazic Jews from the start tended to be more insular. They were never fully isolated. They always were, they were obviously part of the world, but they were more self-conscious about it, and they simply were less part of the outside world. Now, how did this manifest itself? I'll give you an example. If you walked into the home of an Ashkenazic Jew and you looked at the books on the shelf, you were only going to find Jewish books, the Torah, the Talmud, a prayer, a Siddur. If there was going to be poetry, it would be religious poetry, Hebrew poetry. If there was going to be anything, everything was going to be religious, in other words, because Ashkenazic Jews, part of their distrust of the outside world was a distrust of what they called chokhmot chitzoniyot, which in Hebrew means external wisdom or external knowledge. They didn't like to study anything beyond things that were specifically Jewish. But Jews in the world of Islam, if you walked into their house and you looked at the books on the shelf, you would see the classic Jewish library, the Torah, the Tanakh, the Talmud, Jewish writings, all the same stuff, religious poetry, but you would also see books that were not specifically Jewish. You would see Arabic poetry books. You would see Arabic philosophy, Arabic literature. In other words, they lived in a world we would call a dual curriculum world, if we're speaking in pedagogical terms. That's an example of being more part of the outside world. If you found a Jew from the Muslim world, and you stood this person, him or her, next to a Muslim next to a Muslim neighbor, you wouldn't always be able to tell them apart, because oftentimes they would dress the same. Oftentimes they would speak, if not the same language, maybe a similar language, maybe a little bit different dialect. In other words, they were closer culturally to each other than Ashkenazic Jews were to their Christian neighbors. The food of Jews in the Muslim world was much closer to the food of Muslims. Part of that is because Muslims also have restrictions on what they can eat. Christians did not. So there was a kind of immersion, or at least partial immersion, that took place for Jews in the Muslim world that didn't take place as much for Jews in the Ashkenazic world, in the Christian world, because the latter was simply less accommodating, and Ashkenazic Jews tended to be warier. Now this singular difference is going to define the difference between Ashkenazic Jews a long time ago, but as we'll see, another version of it is going to define the difference between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews in the modern world as well. But let's focus on that older world first, and then we'll talk about things more modern. Let's turn and consider how those Jews who lived in Morocco and Spain, how they understood their own origins from Babylonia, from the great rabbinic academies in and around Baghdad, from that world which really had produced the Babylonian Talmud. There are lots of ways to understand it, but I think a clear illustration of it is a story that was told, that was written, well, not written, at least retold, by a Spanish Jew whose name was Abraham ibn Daud. Abraham ibn Daud lived in 12th century Spain. First he lived in Muslim Spain and then in Christian Spain. And among the books he wrote a book called Sefer HaKabbalah. Now I know you hear the word Kabbalah there, but let me first say that has nothing to do with Kabbalah. In fact, the Hebrew word Kabbalah does not mean mysticism. It's used to denote mysticism, but actually means something different. The Hebrew word Kabbalah comes from a Hebrew word which means lekabel, which means to receive. And so the word Kabbalah means that which is received. In fact, in modern Hebrew, the word Kabbalah means receipt. But the way the word was used in an earlier time, that which is received, is closer to the word that we use as tradition than mysticism. So Sefer HaKabbalah means the book of tradition. Now, why is Kabbalah? Why is the word we use for mysticism Kabbalah? It's because mystical ideas in Judaism for a very long time were an oral tradition that was transmitted from master to disciple for a very long time. And so Kabbalah was shorthand for the mystical tradition. But here, Sefer HaKabbalah, the book of tradition by Ibn Daud, this is part of a genre of Jewish writing that's called Shalshelet HaKabbalah, which means the chain of tradition. And this is a particular style of Jewish writing. Basically what you do, you trace the intellectual lineage of the rabbis and scholars of your own time all the way back to Moses. And you write the book from Moses all the way back to your own contemporary rabbis. Maybe the most familiar example of this style of Jewish writing is that book called Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. You know, it starts, Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai and passed it along to Joshua, who passed it along to the elders, who passed it along to the prophets, who passed it along to the rabbis. Imagine extending that chain all the way to, you know, Rabbi Yedwab, or Rabbi Loss, your own rabbis, and then you have a chain of tradition. And Jews, for example, it could be any rabbi, it doesn't have to just be those two, although that would be a fine example. That's part of the genre of the chain of tradition. And Jews in various communities, in order to authenticate not only their own rabbis, but their own Jewish world, their own culture, their own way of life, because if you can say that my rabbi, my spiritual guide, my teachers, their lineage traces back to Moses, we can make those connections. Well, you're not only saying something about your rabbi, you're saying something about your entire community. And so in this book, Sefer HaKabbalah, here's an example where Abraham ibn Daud is expanding the idea that the original Spanish Jews they came straight from the land of Israel. He's sort of elaborating it to show, and I'm going to show you a direct chain from rabbi to disciple, all the way down for the rabbis of Spain. So that's what the book is in general. But in the midst of this book, a passage that really concerns us is a story he adds called The Legend of the Four Captives. This is a story that is going to illustrate the connection between the rabbis of Spain and Morocco on the one hand, and also with a direct connection to the rabbis of Babylonia, to the rabbis of the Talmud and the rabbis of the center of the world, of course, was Baghdad. A direct connection. And this wasn't only a genealogy connection, this story illustrates it, okay? So this is text number 3. Well, let's read some of it and see where it goes. Now remember, he's in the midst of telling a story, and Ibn Daud writes, prior to that, in other words, prior to the story I just told you, it was brought about by the Lord that the income of the academies, the rabbinic academies, which used to come from Spain, the land of the Maghreb, Morocco, Ifriqiya, which is North Africa, today that's Tunisia, and Egypt, and the Holy Land, was discontinued. In other words, one of the ways that the yeshivas of Babylonia established their leadership over the entire Muslim world was they would collect donations from Jewish communities all over the Muslim world, and along with these donations, these Jews living in these outlying communities, many of which were frontier and upstart communities, they would send difficult questions to the rabbis of these academies, questions that they themselves couldn't answer. You see, this is a point where the Jewish communities of Spain and Morocco and other parts of the Islamic world were very young communities. They didn't always have rabbis who could answer the tough questions. And when their local rabbi couldn't answer the question, they would send the question back to Baghdad, to one of these academies, and they would get the answer. And of course, along with the question, you send in a little donation. You want to make sure you get an answer quickly. You put a little tzedakah at the other end. Otherwise, who knows if they're going to answer you or not. This, by the way, is the origin of another genre of Jewish writing called she'elat u'tshuvot, responsa literature. You ask questions of rabbis, they send back. Okay, but this is Ibn Daud explaining why is it that the Jewish communities in Morocco and Spain and elsewhere in the western part of the Muslim world, why did they stop sending donations and questions to the Jews all the way in Babylonia? And this story is going to explain it, the story of the four captives. The following were the circumstances that brought this about. The commander of a fleet, whose name was Ibn Rumachis, left Cordova, Spain, that's Cordoba, having been sent by the Muslim king of Spain, Abd ar-Rahman an-Nasir. This commander of a mighty fleet set out to capture the ships of Christians and the towns that were close to the coast. They encountered a ship carrying 4 great scholars who were traveling from the city of Bari, which is in Italy, to a city called Sephastine. Rumachus captured the ship and took the sages prisoner. Now we find out who these 4 captives were. One was Rabbi Hushiel, the father of Rabbi Hananel. Another was Rabbi Moses, the father of Rabbi Hanoch, who was taken prisoner with his life and with his son, so on and so on. The third was Rabbi Shemariah, ben Rabbi Elchanan. As for the fourth, I do not know his name. Maybe Ibn Daud was looking for some credibility, that he didn't just make it up. If I admit that I don't know his name, maybe you'll believe that this is an actual story. The commander sold Rabbi Shemariah in Alexandria in Egypt. Rabbi Shemariah proceeded to Fushtat, where he became the head of the academy. This is the first great rabbi of the Jews of Egypt. Then he sold Rabbi Hushiel on the coast of Ifriqiya. Ifriqiya is Tunisia. From there, the latter proceeded to the city of Kairouan, which at that time was the mightiest of all Muslim cities in the land of the Maghreb, where he became the head of the academy, where he begot his son, Rabbi Hananel. That's the first great rabbi of Morocco. So this part of the story is illustrating that the first great rabbi of Morocco, he arrived there because he had left. Actually, he was captured by a pirate from Spain. He was traveling around in Italy looking for contributions to bring back to his rabbinic academy back in Baghdad. But the point here is he's from Baghdad. The greatness of the Jewish community of Morocco and North Africa and Spain begins when these rabbis arrive from Babylonia. Then the commander arrived at Cordova, where he sold Rabbi Moses along with Rabbi Hanoch. In other words, there's a similar story about the way Spain became a great Jewish community. Now, since Ibn Daud is from Spain, he's going to put this story at the center of the story. Okay? Now, there was in Cordoba, he was redeemed by the people of Cordoba, who were under the impression that he was a man of no education. In other words, these rabbis apparently didn't reveal who they were to the pirate who had captured them. Because if you capture a rabbi, you can ask for a much greater ransom. But if you're some ordinary person on a ship, not necessarily. So the Jews of Cordova redeemed him, but they didn't know who he was. Now, there was in Cordoba a synagogue that was called the College Synagogue, where a judge by the name of Rabbi Nathan the Pious, Rabbi Natan HaChassid, who was a man of distinction, used to preside. However, the people of Spain were not thoroughly versed in the words of the rabbis of blessed memory. Nevertheless, with the little knowledge they did possess, they conducted a school and interpreted the traditions more or less accurately. They did their best to study the Talmud, but they couldn't always figure out the answers to their own questions. Once Rabbi Nathan explain the law requiring immersions of the finger for each sprinkling. Never mind, it's some nitty-gritty thing about how you're supposed to wash your hands before you eat, which is found in the Tractate Yoma, but he was able to explain it correctly. Thereupon, Rabbi Moses, he was the rabbi they redeemed from the ship, but they didn't know was a rabbi, who was seated in the corner like an attendant. Attendant here means custodian. He's basically, they think he's basically was hired to be the janitor in the synagogue because they didn't know he was a rabbinic scholar, arose before Rabbi Nathan and said before him, Rabbi, this would result in an excess of immersions. In other words, the janitor stood up and answered the Talmudic question that the scholars or the rabbi didn't know. It's almost comical if you think about it. The janitor knows the answer. This is supposed to be an ignorant, uneducated man. When he and the students heard his words, they marveled to each other and asked him to explain the law. This he did quite properly. Then each of them propounded all the difficulties which he had, and he replied to them out of the abundance of his wisdom. Turns out the custodian turned out to be the greatest rabbinic scholar of them all because he was a rabbi who had come all the way from Baghdad. Outside the college, there were litigants who were not permitted to enter until the students had completed their lesson. On that day, Rabbi Nathan, the judge, walked out, and the litigants followed. However, he said to them, I am no longer judge. This man, who is garbed in rags and is a stranger, is my master, and I shall be his disciple from this day on. You ought to appoint him judge of the community of Cordova, And that is exactly what they did. The community then assigned him a large stipend and honored him with costly garments and a carriage. He became the chief rabbi of this up-and-coming, upstart Jewish community of Cordoba, which is the same thing that happened with the Jewish community in Morocco and in North Africa and in Egypt. Each of these captives turned out to be the first local chief rabbi. Okay, at that point, here's the punchline of the story. The commander, the guy who had captured that ship, wished to retract his sail because he redeemed what he thought was some ordinary schlub who turned out to be a great rabbinic scholar who he could have gotten a lot more ransom for. However, the king, meaning the king of Spain, would not permit him to do so, for he was delighted by the fact that the Jews of his domain no longer had need of the people of Babylonia. In other words, the king of Spain was trying to make the Muslim kingdom of Spain independent from the center of the Muslim world, and he saw the Jews of Spain becoming independent of the Jews of Baghdad, part of the process of the whole kingdom becoming independent. And similarly, the king of Morocco also treasured the fact that the Jewish community of Morocco could now function like an independent Jewish community. Now, the point of the story is twofold. First of all, this is how the Jews of Spain and the Jews of Morocco, how they become self-sustaining, independent Jewish communities as part of these independent kingdoms. But the story also tells us that all of these communities were part of a single cultural world. They have common origins. They're part of this world of not only rabbinic learning, but part of this larger outlook toward the world. And if you traveled from Spain to Morocco to North Africa to Egypt to Baghdad, there was this common thread that ran through all these Jewish communities. There was this sense of worldliness that ran through all of them. Now, I want to be clear. When I say these Jews were worldly, they were still second-class citizens. They were still, they were not really, they were not top tier. But they all experienced a measure of stability and comfort in the Muslim world. Certainly that was superior to the levels that Jews experienced elsewhere. And this is what really bred their sense of comfort with the outside world. And where do we see this? Especially not only in the libraries in their home, but in the schoolhouse. The Jewish schools, the notion of Jewish education in the Ashkenazic world, it won't surprise you to hear, was relatively narrow. The notion of Jewish education in the Sephardic world, or more broadly in the Muslim world, was much broader. Let me illustrate that with an example here. Look at text number 4 and 5. These are two early Ashkenazic rabbis interpreting passages from the Talmud which explain what is it that Jewish students should study. Now here, when I say Jewish students, we're talking about Jewish boys. This is long before Jewish girls were ever given an education. That's a different story, all right? The first one comes from Rashi, who is really the first great Ashkenazic rabbi. And the second one comes from one of his disciples, whose name was Rabbeinu Tam, who was not only Rashi's disciple, but also Rashi's son-in-law. Okay, so what does Rashi say? Rashi is interpreting, there's a passage in the Talmud describing how one should educate their children, which says, Man'u bnechem min higayon. This is text number 4. Keep your children away from logic. We don't want our teachers to think too much. And how does Rashi understand this? This might surprise you. Don't drill too much with Bible into them. Don't teach them too much Tanakh, since it is very alluring. Rashi is instructing, when we teach young people in the Cheder, they shouldn't learn too much Bible, because Bible stories, they're just too hard to really control. They go in all directions. So you're wondering, wait, if Rashi is saying, don't teach them Bible, what are they supposed to teach? And here the upshot, the curriculum of the Ashkenazic school for centuries, I would say to the end of the 18th century, the curriculum consisted of learning rabbinic texts. You learn legal texts largely by rote. And you only study Bible You only study those passages of the Bible that are necessary to understand legal text. And that's what the Ashkenazic schoolhouse was. Look what Rabbeinu Tam added to that in text number 5, okay? In the Talmud, elsewhere in the Talmud, there's a passage which says, a person should divide his learning time into 3. 1/3 for Bible, 1/3 for Mishnah, 1/3 for Talmud. Well, that sounds like you're supposed to, like contrary to Rashi, you're supposed to study the Bible, but the Tosfot, quoting Rabbeinu Tam, who is Rashi's son-in-law, says, according to Rabbeinu Tam, it is enough for us to occupy ourselves only with the study of the Talmud, since the Talmud is a mixture of Bible, Mishnah, and Talmud. We don't need to study the Bible. Now, if you're not studying the Bible, if even that is beyond the narrow corpus of Jewish education, you're definitely not studying anything else. You're not studying philosophy or poetry or literature or even grammar. You would learn Hebrew by rote, and you would learn rabbinic text by rote, and that was the Cheder education of Ashkenazic Jews. That was the Cheder, that was the Talmud Torah, that was the yeshiva education in the Ashkenazic world. Now, I told you that to make the following contrast. Look at text number 6. This is an excerpt from a medieval Jewish writer who lived both in Morocco and Spain, a medieval curriculum of Jewish and secular studies. This is what young Jews learned in the schoolhouses in the world of Islam, in Spain, in Morocco, and North Africa. And, you know, I will read a little bit of it, but I want you to just note how broad it is in terms of subjects, the breadth of it. Reading and writing. The method of instruction must so be arranged that the teacher will first begin with the script and so on. There's nothing about reading and you're supposed to learn to read by rote, but writing wasn't even part of the curriculum for Ashkenazic schools. Torah, Mishnah, and Hebrew grammar. Now, the grammar part is novel here. From the Ashkenazic schoolhouse, you need to know the words, but you don't need to know the grammar of the words. Then he is so for the Sephardic school, then he is to teach them the Pentateuch, prophets, and Bible with an eye to vocalization and modulation in order that they may be able to pronounce the accents correctly. Then he is to have them learn the Mishnah until they acquired a fluency. The teacher is to continue until they are 10 years old. The children are then to be taught the rules of grammar. There's an actual curriculum here. Can you believe it? Poetry. Instruct his pupils in poetry. Talmud, when the pupils are 15 years of age, the teacher should give them much practice in Talmud reading until they have acquired fluency in it. That's the same as the Ashkenazic school. However, later when they are 18 years of age, after 3 years of just studying Talmud just for the basic meaning, the teacher should give them that type of instruction in it that lays emphasis on deeper understanding, independent thinking, and investigation. Don't just learn what the Talmud says. Learn to think critically and analytically about the Talmud. This you don't find in the Ashkenazic schoolhouse. And then it goes on beyond simply Jewish learning, philosophic observations on religion. This really comes down to learn to think critically about rival religious groups like Christians and Muslims, Christianity and Islam, philosophic studies. The first comprises mathematical science, then natural science, and then metaphysics. This is a real, what today we would call a dual curriculum. This is like the original, well, even to call it a day school. I didn't learn this much in day school. This is a lot. Logic, mathematics, arithmetic, astronomy, natural sciences, metaphysics, each one with a specific instruction as to not just to teach it by rote or in a narrow fashion, in a broad fashion. Now, I want to be clear. This is not what every single Sephardic child, every child in the world of Islam learned. Because typically, this quality of education was for the elite of the Jewish community. Not everyone got this. But the very fact that there was, if in every generation, in every Jewish community in the Muslim world, there was an elite group of children who learned this, as opposed to the narrow education in the Ashkenazic schoolhouse, it had a real rippling and accumulative effect, because typically the elite, the children who got this elite education, they would become the next generation of leaders of the Jewish community. They were the ones who really set the tone for all Jews in the community. And so this perpetuated that mindset, that willingness to think openly about the non-Jewish world and critically about the non-Jewish world. but also critically even about the Jewish world as well. Now, along with this, there was also a very different ideal of, well, a very different image of the ideal scholar in the Ashkenazic world versus the Sephardic world. In the Ashkenazic world, the ideal rabbinic scholar was someone who'd mastered the Talmud. End of story. But in the Sephardic world, and more broadly in the Islamic world, it wasn't enough. To be considered an ideal rabbinic scholar, Talmud was not enough. You also had to be a master Bible scholar, but you also had to be a master of other forms of knowledge, including philosophy. And I don't mean Jewish philosophy only, I mean Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy had come to the Muslim world when the works of Aristotle and Plato were translated by a Muslim scholar whose name was Averroes. So when these Jews would study Greek philosophy, they would study it in an Arabic translation called the Kalam, but they studied the ideas of Aristotle along with their Jewish curriculum as well. And here's the interesting part. They studied both. They regarded both as part of knowledge. They didn't see one as inferior to the other. You were incomplete as a scholar if you didn't know both. Now, if you don't believe me, this idea of the ideal scholar was articulated very boldly by none other than Maimonides. Now, Maimonides, I believe we mentioned him briefly last time. He was born in Spain. His family eventually fled to Morocco and then made their way to Egypt. So he is someone who really traversed the world of Islam. He was also the epitome of everything I've just explained. That curriculum of learning, that was what Maimonides knew. He was not only a product of it, he became the exemplar of it, and he became the one who said, this is what you need to know if you want to be a true rabbinic scholar in this world, in these communities. This is what you need to know. And he illustrated it with what he called the parable of the king's court. This comes from one of his main philosophical work called The Guide to the Perplexed. So first I say, parenthetically, unlike his law code, which he wrote in Hebrew for all Jews to, even rank and file Jews to read, The Guide to the Perplexed was a philosophical work which he wrote in Arabic, which was only for the Jewish elite. So not all Jews were reading this, only Jews with a proper education and training. Now, the Guide to the Perplexed, the reason he wrote this book was for young adults, young students who were perplexed by the contradictions between Jewish ideas and philosophical ideas, because Judaism and Greek philosophy, the Talmud, the rabbis and Aristotle didn't always agree. In fact, they had some very fundamental disagreements on things. I'll just give you one example. According to the Greeks, according to Aristotle, matter is eternal. All creation consisted of was God ordering the universe. In Greek philosophy, for Aristotle, there's no such thing as creating something out of nothing. But in Judaism, matter is not eternal. God is eternal. God created the world out of nothing. So you have these young people who said, on the one hand, I have this belief that says God created the world out of nothing, but I also have this notion that there's no such thing as creation out of nothing. Maimonides wrote this book to help these young people deal with these perplexing contradictions. And he was able to resolve a lot of them. But this particular passage I share with you because here is where Maimonides, through this parable, describes the ideal rabbinic scholar. Okay, this is text number 7. Maimonides says, I will begin with the subject of this chapter with a simile. Here's a parable, a simile, an allegory. A king is, now he's going to explain it afterwards, so try to picture it as I go. A king is in his palace. Spoiler alert, the king is God. A king is in his palace, and all his subjects are partly in the country and partly abroad. Some are closer, some are farther away. All this, by the way, is going to be how close are you to the king and his palace, to the king and his court. Of the former, Some have their backs turned toward the king's palace. Some have their faces in another direction. Some are desirous and zealous to go to the palace, seeking to inquire in his temple, to minister before him, but have not yet seen the face of the wall of the house. Of those that desire to go to the palace, some reach it and go around in search of the entrance gate, and others have passed through the gate and walk about in the antechamber. Others have succeeded in entering the inner part of the palace and being in the same room with the king in the royal palace. Yada, yada, yada. Basically, the point here is that there are all these different people. Some are closer to the king, and some are farther from the king. Some have their backs to the king. It's all about being closer or farther away, more remote or more intimate. Okay. Now, if you look on the next page, in that first full paragraph, 3 lines from the top, he's going to explain this simile. What do all these different gradations of being close to God represent? I will now explain the simile which I have made. The people who are abroad and all those who have no religion are all those who have no religion whatsoever, neither one based on speculation nor one received by tradition. Such are the extreme Turks that wander about the north, the Cushites who live in the south, those in our country who are like these. In other words, the people who are the farthest away are just ignoramuses. All right? I consider these irrational beings, not as much human beings. Maimonides wasn't always that politically correct. They are below mankind, but above monkeys, since they have the form and shape of man and a mental faculty above that of the monkey. Okay. Remember, he wrote this 1,000 years ago. No way would he have written that today. Those who are in the country, and other closer to the court, but have their backs turned toward the king, are those who possess religion, belief, and thought, but happen to hold false doctrines, which they either adopted in consequence of great mistakes made in their own speculations, or received from others who misled them. In other words, those who don't have the enlightenment to be Jewish. You believe in God, but you believe in God in the wrong way. You're a Christian, you're a Muslim, you're a pagan. Especially pagan. Because of these doctrines, they recede more and more from the royal palace. The more they seem to proceed, they are worse off than the first class, and under certain circumstances, they become necessary to deny them and extirpate their doctrines in order that others should not be misled. Okay. Now, here we're getting closer. Those who desire to arrive at the palace, the ones who are trying to get close to God truly, and to enter it, but have never yet seen it, are the mass of religious people, the multitude that observe the divine commandments but are ignorant. In other words, observant Jews who are not learned Jews. They observe commandments, but they have no idea why. Those who arrive at the palace but go around it are those who devote themselves exclusively to the study of practical law. They believe traditionally in true principles of faith and learn the practical worship of God, but are not trained in philosophical treatment of the principles of the law and do not endeavor to establish the truth of their faith by proof. In other words, if all you know is the Talmud, you're closer than others, but you're not all the way there. You're still partly ignorant. This is Maimonides' way of saying, you know, all those Ashkenazic rabbis we hear about across the Pyrenees, they think they're the be-all and end-all. They don't realize they're actually missing something. Those who undertake to investigate the principles of religion have come to the antechamber, and there is no doubt that these can also be divided into different grades. Those who have succeeded in finding a proof for everything that can be proved, who have a true knowledge of God from religion and from philosophy, so far as a true knowledge can be attained, are near the truth. Wherever an approach to the truth is possible, they have reached the goal. In other words, the true scholar, the truly enlightened Jew, is one who knows the Talmud and also philosophy. And of course, it's not surprising that the ultimate Jew Maimonides, of course, is talking about is himself. Because whenever philosophers write these sort of progressions, it always winds up on their own desk, and their own pen, in their own mind. Maimonides is the be-all and end-all, but he's not the only be-all and end-all. He's just an example of the be-all and end-all because he knows both. But there's this expectation that to really be a fully formed Jew, you can't simply live in the world of Judaism. You have to live outside of it. Now, the consequence of this is that during the course of the Middle Ages, Jews in the Muslim world, Sephardic Jews and others, they had this, not only a blend of the religious and the secular, religious and the general, but it was a seamless and unself-conscious blend. They lived with one foot in each world, but they did it seamlessly. They didn't think about it. It was natural. There was no notion that things that are not Jewish are dangerous or subversive and should be kept at arm's length. They embraced it all. They saw it all as part of this mixture, this big mishmash called life. Now, after 1492, as I explained, when Jews are expelled from Spain, the majority of Jews who are expelled from Spain, they go to other parts of the Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. And here's something very interesting happens. Typically, when you have an indigenous community absorbing refugees from another country, the refugees adapt. Jews who came to America adapted to America. But the Sephardic Jews who came to these other places, the communities adapted to them. Historians call this the Sephardicization of the Jews of the Muslim world. We have Sephardic communities all over the Muslim world. It happened in reverse because the culture of Sephardic Jews was so impressive and so magnificent and so alluring compared to what the local Jews had. And so the Sephardic way of life became more or less, the culture and the religious outlook across the Muslim world. And so Jews who lived in the Ottoman Empire, really by the 19th century, were largely Sephardic Jews. Not genealogically Sephardic, but they were culturally Sephardic. By the way, with Ashkenazic Jews, we have sort of something kind of analogous. Jews who went from Central Europe to Eastern Europe, the Jews who were in Poland adapted themselves to the German Jews who were coming in. That's why one of the reasons why Jews in Poland speak Yiddish and not some Jewish dialect of Polish, but that's a different story. Okay, now this salient feature of Sephardic Jews, this living comfortably in both worlds, this is going to be a critical difference between the way Sephardic Jews encounter the modern world versus the way Ashkenazic Jews encounter the modern world. For Ashkenazic Jews, the encounter with the modern world meant a series of abrupt and drastic changes. Enlightenment, I mean European enlightenment, which defined Jews like everyone else, which invited Jews to be part of mainstream European society. Citizenship, which made it possible for Jews to live beyond the Jewish community. And of course, associated with enlightenment and citizenship, the pressure to assimilate. The pressure to give up one's Jewishness and become part of a larger world. For Ashkenazic Jews, it was very alluring, and the opportunities it presented were remarkable, but it wasn't without its difficult moments. So let me briefly tell you what it produced in the Ashkenazic world, and then we'll make a contrast. Simply put, what the series of abrupt and traumatic changes produced for Ashkenazic Jews is what today we would call labels or denominations. Ashkenazic Jews are the only Jews in the world who have labels or denominations. Now, prior to the 18th century or the 19th century, there were no labels or denominations in the Ashkenazic Jews either, in the Ashkenazic world either. The whole world of Judaism was simply Judaism. There was one basket of ideas and beliefs and practices and symbols and institutions, and you were more observant or less observant, you were pious or a heretic, but there was one thing called Judaism, Yahadut, Yiddishkeit, whatever you were. And that was true everywhere. But with the encounter with modernity for Ashkenazic Jews, and particularly German Jews, produced two new kinds of Judaism. And they're actually born at the same time. One is Reform Judaism, and one is Orthodox Judaism. Now, you may say that. What do you mean? What do you mean it created Orthodox Judaism? Wasn't Orthodox Judaism around all the time? No. Before the year 1800, there were no Jews in the world who were Orthodox. They were simply Jewish. Orthodox Judaism was born as a response to Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism was born as a way of assuring the state and the non-Jewish world around the Ashkenazic Jewish community that Jews could be worthy of citizenship, that Jews could actually enter mainstream society. This was something that was necessary in the Ashkenazic world because for so long, Ashkenazic Jews had lived in a largely insular fashion. They had kept the outside world at bay. And Ashkenazic Judaism had had this innate suspicion of the outside world. These were Jews who needed to prove their worthiness of citizenship to their neighbors. Now, it's also true that the possibility of citizenship came first to Europe and later to the Muslim world. But the simple fact is, reform, a redefinition of Judaism compatible with citizenship and modernity, was a 19th century invention, and in response to that was orthodoxy. Now you're wondering, what's the difference between orthodoxy and what came before? Well, in terms of observance, in some ways it's the same, but this earlier traditional Judaism we've been talking about, both in its Ashkenazic and Sephardic context, it had certain characteristics. First of all, it had a certain measure of diversity. It was fluid, it was dynamic, it evolved, it wasn't rigid. But orthodoxy, well, look at your handout. The first Orthodox rabbi, the person who really coined this mentality, was a rabbi from Germany and then Hungary whose name was Moses Sofer, known by his pen name, the Khatam Sofer. In text number 8, his mantra was, Kol davar chadash asur me haTorah. Anything that is new is forbidden by the Torah. Now the oddity there, and the paradox on which Orthodox Judaism was founded, was the fact that the notion that anything new is forbidden by the Torah is itself new. But this was something situational and circumstantial. That's what I mean by the twin birth of Reform and Orthodox Judaism. This was in response to the new notion of Judaism created by Reform Jews. And naturally, Reform and Orthodox Jews were at odds with one another. But these are two responses to some very different changes. Now, that itself is a much more complicated story. I could say lots. But let's come back. I'm using that to contrast what happened in the Sephardic world. Because in the Sephardic world, we have none of that. The fact of the matter is, when modernity comes to the world of Islam, when Jews are invited to participate in mainstream culture and to embrace citizenship, it's a much easier change because these Jews have already been living with one foot in the world of mainstream society. They were second-class citizens, but the transition was not as traumatic. Consequently, there was never any need for Reform Judaism in the Muslim world. And since there was no need for Reform Judaism in the Muslim world, there was no need for the backlash known as Orthodox Judaism in the Muslim world. For Sephardic Jews, this earlier, fluid, seamless, unself-conscious Judaism simply continued with no labels and no denominations. They never really needed them. And why would they? Now, this is a lot to take. You may not believe me, but let me give you a couple of examples so you don't have to take my word for it. I'll give you two examples of two 20th century leading Sephardic rabbis, both who lived in Israel. Okay? The first, text number 9, this is a rabbi whose name was Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel. He was the chief Sephardic rabbi, first of Palestine in the 30s and 40s, then of the state of Israel. And Rabbi Uziel, he responded directly to what Moses Sofer had said as the mantra of orthodoxy. Listen to what he writes in text number 9. Life's conditions, changes in values, discoveries in technology and science produce in every generation new questions and problems that demand solutions. We cannot avert our eyes from these questions by saying that which is new is forbidden by the Torah. He looks directly at the mentality of orthodoxy created by Ashkenazic Jews and said, absolutely not. That's just not right. He says the opposite. Not only does Judaism never change, Judaism must change, because only by adapting can Judaism address the great questions and challenges of the age. That's a very different mentality. One of the ways the difference here manifests itself is part of the mentality of this orthodoxy, which opposes change, is the notion, what one sociologist called chumrah culture. Chumrah is an Aramaic word which means stringency. Stricter is necessarily better, more authentic. No, Sephardic Jews never bought into that. Sometimes they're stricter, sometimes they're more lenient, but both are equally authentic. Let me give you one more example. This comes from a rabbi named Chaim David Halevi, who was the rabbi of Tel Aviv during the 50s, the Sephardic rabbi of Tel Aviv during the 50s and 60s. This is what he writes in text number 10. One who thinks halacha is rigid and that there is no deviating from it in any direction is very much in error. On the contrary, and this is if the mantra of Ashkenazic orthodoxy is anything new is forbidden by the Torah, the mantra of being a Sephardic Jew is ein gemishut k'mo gemishuta shel halacha. There is no flexibility like the flexibility of Jewish law. Judaism adapts itself to circumstance in an ongoing process. And he goes on to say, and only because of the flexibility of halacha and the power of numerous productive innovations undertaken by the sages of Israel in their own time, has the people of Israel been able to follow the path of Torah and commandments for thousands of years. And only because of this has it been possible for Jews to observe the Torah. Now I have to add a little caveat here, and this is going to disappoint you because you might walk away saying, oh, look at that. Sephardic rabbis, they're just like Reformed Jews. They think, they think it's important for things to change. Not exactly. Because for both of these rabbis, yes, Judaism adapts, Judaism is flexible, Judaism is dynamic, but there was one non-negotiable criterion for Judaism innovating or adapting. Any innovation or change had to be justified within pre-existing legal precedent and custom. You had to make the argument saying that, yes, we can make this change, but we can't make this change because the spirit of the age demands it. We can only make this change if we can find a legal justification for it. Now, this will explain, for example, why I just described this culture which is fluid and adaptive. But it's a Sephardic world that has really never embraced the idea of women participating in the service. See, in the Ashkenazic world, there are women who read the Torah, who lead the service, who are counted in a minyan, who are rabbis. In the Sephardic world, even though they have this greater willingness to adapt, they've never found the legal justification to allow women to do any of that. So I don't want to get carried away with this. There's an overall outlook of fluidity and flexibility, but the limiting factor is it must be justified halachically in terms of Jewish law. So what we have is, in contrast to the Ashkenazic world, which is one way, and then until a certain moment, and then when the world turns modern, abruptly turns into something else, split up by denominations and labels, with one group saying we can make extensive changes according to the spirit of the age, and another group saying we can't make any changes. In the Sephardic world, it all happens more gradually and more seamlessly, for better, for worse. But this is the mentality of Sephardic Jews, and more broadly, this is the mentality of Jews who lived in the world of Islam. And so for Jews who lived in Morocco, their world of Judaism was, on the one hand, in some ways, it was more fluid than their Ashkenazic contemporaries. And they had a more seamless and painless transition to modernity than did their Ashkenazic contemporaries. But by the 20th century, Ashkenazic Jews are willing to take a lot more chances to invent. These denominations lead to a much broader range of what it is to be Jewish. And I'll end with one last example. Zionism, especially secular Zionism, is an invention of Ashkenazic Jews. And that makes perfect sense because Ashkenazic Jews were more comfortable in inventing new notions of Judaism that broke with tradition. Sephardic Jews, they never really needed Zionism until a little bit later. But also, Zionism for them, they could find no justification for living apart from the world of religion. Because for them, the worldliness and the traditionalness were two parts of the seamless, fluid way of life which defined Sephardic Jews for centuries. Thank you very much. So, I think we have a few minutes for some questions. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Cool. Is there one? Anybody? Oh, hi. I didn't see you. Vakasha. Okay, that's fine too. I mean, that's fine, but it maybe means I'm a little bit in trouble too. That's okay. No. Anybody else? If there are no questions, well, let me tell you, in the last lecture, we're going to turn more specifically to modernity. We're going to look at the modern problems of Moroccan Jews, particularly as the Islamic world becomes less and more antagonistic to Jews, particularly the impact of Zionism and how it becomes more difficult to live in Morocco in the advent of Zionism in the State of Israel. That we'll turn to next time. Toda rabah.
Thank you to Dr. Lupovitch, as always, an amazing scholar and friend. If you were here thinking you were getting inoculations and you didn't find Nurse Lisa, she's here, so hang back and she will find you. Everyone else, we'll see you next time. There's going to be an amazing service on Friday night, by the way, where we're introducing our new album. So you should come. It's going to be great.